You know, one of the most powerful things I've ever witnessed in my years as an eye health specialist is the moment a patient realizes that what they assumed was just getting older was actually something that could be addressed, improved, and in many cases, reversed. That moment of relief, of hope, rekindled. It never gets old for me. And if you are over 60, if you've been quietly accepting blurry mornings, faded colors, or struggling to read the menu at a restaurant as simply part of the deal of aging, I want you to stay with me today, because what I'm about to share might change the way you think about your eyes forever. If this kind of content speaks to you, please consider subscribing to this channel. We are here every week with real cases, real science, and real solutions for people who refuse to let age define what they can see and experience in life. Now, let me tell you about James. James was 70 years old when he first walked into my office, and I want you to picture him clearly, because James is not an unusual man. He is the kind of man you might know. Retired after 40 years working as a civil engineer, he spent his mornings drinking coffee on the porch, watching the birds at the feeder his late wife had hung years ago. He loved reading Western novels, doing crossword puzzles, and watching old classic films on weekend evenings. He was active, mentally sharp, and by all accounts, living a good life. But there was something bothering him, something he had been quietly brushing aside for almost 2 years before he finally decided to come see me. It started gradually, the way these things often do. James noticed that reading had become more of an effort than it used to be. Words on the page seemed slightly blurred, especially in the morning or late at night. He figured he needed stronger reading glasses, so he went to one of those pharmacy racks and picked up a pair with a higher magnification. That helped for a while, or at least he told himself it did. Then he started noticing something else. Colors didn't seem quite as vivid as he remembered. The blue of the sky, the green of the trees in his backyard. They still looked fine to him logically, but something felt muted, like the brightness had been turned down just a notch. He mentioned it once to his son during a Sunday call, and his son said, "Dad, you're 70. Your eyes are just getting older." And James accepted that. For 2 more years, he accepted that. Then one evening, he was trying to read a letter from his bank, and he noticed that the straight lines of the printed text seemed to bow slightly in the center of his vision. Not dramatically, not in an alarming way, but enough to make him stop and blink and look again. He covered his right eye and looked with his left. The lines bowed. He covered his left eye and looked with his right. They looked straight. He sat there quietly for a long moment, that letter in his hands, and for the first time, something inside him shifted from quiet acceptance to a small but clear signal of concern. That weekend, his son drove him to my office. I remember the day James came in. He sat across from me with that particular kind of patience that many older patients carry, a patience that sometimes borders on resignation. He described his symptoms carefully and methodically, the way an engineer would, blurring when reading, muted colors, and then, almost as an afterthought, the bowing of straight lines in his left eye. When he mentioned that last symptom, I leaned forward in my chair. Because while blurry vision and color changes can have many explanations, distortion of straight lines is a very specific signal. It pointed me immediately toward the macula, a tiny but extraordinarily important part of the retina at the back of the eye. Let me explain something here, because I think understanding your own eyes is one of the most powerful things you can do for your health. The retina is the light-sensitive layer at the back of your eye, and it works a little like the film in an old camera. It captures the image of the world and sends it to your brain. At the very center of the retina sits the macula, a small area no bigger than a pencil eraser, but responsible for your central, detailed vision. Reading a book, recognizing a face, seeing the expression in someone's eyes, all of that depends on the macula working well. As we age, the macula becomes more vulnerable, and certain factors can accelerate that vulnerability in ways that many people are completely unaware of. I performed a dilated eye exam on James, and I also used a simple tool called an Amsler grid, which is essentially a grid of straight lines that helps detect distortion in central vision. For James's left eye, the distortion was clear. There were early changes in his macula that needed attention. It was not yet at a critical stage, but it was a warning his body had been sending him for a long time, and James had been interpreting it as simply the voice of old age. Now, here's what I want you to understand, because this is the part of the conversation that changed everything for James. Macular health is not entirely out of our hands. While genetics and age do play a role, research over the past 2 decades has made it increasingly clear that nutrition, lifestyle, and specific habits have a profound influence on how the macula ages. And most people over 60 are walking around with significant deficiencies in the very nutrients their eyes need most. I asked James about his diet. He was honest with me. Since his wife passed 3 years ago, his cooking had become simple. Toast in the morning, a sandwich at lunch, sometimes a frozen dinner in the evening. He wasn't eating poorly out of neglect, he just wasn't thinking about it. When I asked him specifically about dark leafy greens, about eggs, about colorful vegetables like peppers and corn, he shook his head slowly. "I never was much of a vegetable person," he said. "This mattered enormously. The macula depends heavily on 2 pigments called lutein and zeaxanthin. These are not things your body can produce on its own. You have to get them from food, primarily from sources like kale, spinach, eggs, and brightly colored produce. These pigments act as a kind of internal sunscreen for the macula, filtering harmful blue light and protecting the delicate photoreceptors from oxidative damage. When the body is chronically low in lutein and zeaxanthin, the macular pigment thins, and the macula becomes more vulnerable to the kind of changes James was experiencing. Beyond that, I explained to James that certain lifestyle factors were compounding the issue. He spent time outdoors without sunglasses, exposing his eyes to UV and high-energy visible light without protection. He had been a smoker for 30 years, though he had quit a decade ago, and the cumulative effect of smoking on retinal health can persist long after the habit ends. His diet was also low in omega-3 fatty acids, which play a critical role in the health of the photoreceptor cells and the thin blood vessels that feed the retina. James listened to everything I said with that same careful, engineerly attention. Then he asked me quietly, "Is there something I can actually do?" And that is always the question I love to answer. Yes, James. There absolutely is. We started with the basics. I encouraged him to gradually introduce more lutein-rich foods into his daily meals. Eggs for breakfast instead of toast alone. A handful of spinach stirred into soup. Bell peppers sliced alongside his sandwich. Small, sustainable changes. I also recommended quality UV protective sunglasses for his morning porch time. Hydration, which many older adults chronically neglect, was also part of our conversation, as the eye tissues depend on good circulation and fluid balance. I encouraged him to talk to his primary care physician about his omega-3 levels and general antioxidant status. And I also told him something else. I told him that there is a wealth of evidence supporting the role of targeted nutritional supplementation in supporting macular health, particularly for individuals in his age group who may struggle to obtain therapeutic levels of key nutrients through diet alone. I mentioned that there is a resource I often point my patients toward, something I have seen make a meaningful difference for many of them, and it is available in the first link in the description of this video. I won't tell you exactly what it is just yet, because I want you to discover it for yourself the way my patients do, with curiosity and an open mind. What I will say is that it is directly related to everything we have discussed today, and it may be one of the most important things you do for your eyes this year. James came back to see me 4 months later. The distortion in his left eye had not progressed. His overall macular pigment density, which we can measure with specialized imaging, had improved. He was sleeping better, eating better, and for the first time in years, he told me he had gone back to reading his Western novels without the frustration that had been quietly stealing that joy from him. He looked at me and said, "I almost just let it go. I almost just told myself it was age." I nodded. I hear that more than almost anything else in this office. Your eyes are not simply victims of time. They are living tissue that respond to care, to nutrition, to attention. The changes that many people over 60 experience are real, but they are not always inevitable, and they are rarely beyond support. The first step is simply refusing to accept the story that nothing can be done. If you found value in James's story today, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Every week we share real cases and honest conversations about eye health that I believe everyone over 60 deserves to hear. And please, do not forget to check the first link in the description. What you find there is a natural continuation of everything we talked about today, and it might just be the turning point your own vision story has been waiting for. Thank you for being here. Take care of those eyes. They have a lifetime of beauty still left to show you.